First, documenting a remarkable contribution to music in Scotland, BBC Two Scotland profiles Sir Alexander Gibson.
He entered the Scottish musical scene at a time when nothing was happening at all, and he made things happen.
He was out in front as a leader and as an innovator.
He had that ability to charm an audience.
A true performer, very exciting to work for.
He was the most complete musician I've ever encountered.
Many composers, not just Scottish composers, have a great debt to Alexander Gibson.
In the 1950s, the musical landscape of Scotland was very different from today. It was stagnant, dull and uninteresting. There was no professional opera company, no full-sized symphony orchestra, no top-class international chorus. Top composers had fled the country. The only beacon of light was at the Edinburgh Festival, which, for a few weeks of the year, was bringing to Scotland musicians of the highest international standard. But changes were at hand. A young Scot, 33-year-old Alexander Gibson, was coming home with a vision and a mission. As the new principal conductor of the Scottish National Orchestra, he was to trigger and preside over the most important musical renaissance in the history of Scotland.
The call came from the Scottish National Orchestra that they decided that they wanted to have a British and preferably Scottish conductor. So I came here in '59 full of fear and trepidation, you know, to follow all these famous conductors who'd been here before.
Gibson was born in Motherwell in 1926. As a child, he had displayed a good ear for music. By his early teens, he was a proficient pianist and church organist. DL High School was the ideal school for the young Gibson to attend. It was famed for its strong musical tradition, and Gibson's precocious talent was immediately spotted.
They had a tradition of putting on Gilbert and Sullivan operas, and their annual performances in the Empire Theatre in Motherwell. And they had cast all the major roles, and they couldn't get a comic to sing the Major General. Somebody who would at least be able to stay in the right bar through all the patter. So I had the temerity and the audacity to actually go on and sing the Major General.
It was while at school that Gibson was taken to his first opera, Madame Butterfly, and also had his first taste of conducting, significantly Valse Triste by Sibelius, a composer he would champion throughout his life. Was it secret ambition or a sense of his own destiny that inspired him to write in the school magazine that he deplored the fact that nearly all eminent modern musicians bore foreign names, and he looked forward to the day when Scotland would have great performers and a distinct musical life of its own? 4 years of national service saw him serve as a pianist with the Royal Signals Band, playing all the popular piano concertos. He then applied to study at the Royal College of Music in London, where he was expected to train as a concert pianist and accompanist. He, however, had rather different ideas.
I went in on that spring term to the Royal College of Music. The first thing I said to the registrar was, in my interview, was, well, I haven't gone back to finish a degree in music at Glasgow University or to the Academy of Music to do anything further. I've come to the Royal College of Music because you have a conducting class and an orchestra on which to learn conducting.
Of course.
They said, oh, everybody wants to be conductors. No. You're a pianist. Besides, you need the paperwork qualifications for all that. And I said, well, what are they? They said, it doesn't matter what they are, you haven't got them.
There was a little Scottish contingent down there. We had David Ward, we had Alec and myself, and someone who always wished that she was Scottish. Her parents were Scottish, Joan Sutherland.
Thankfully, Gibson was not daunted by officialdom and soon organised his own student orchestra before being finally accepted into the college conducting class.
The first orchestra consisted of my fellow students. You could say that that's not facing a professional orchestra, but believe me, facing your fellow students is worse than facing a professional orchestra, because whilst most of them are your friends, some of them are close friends, and others possibly rivals or whatever, they're undoubtedly the most critical of somebody who stands up to presume to conduct them. So, in a way, it was a somewhat traumatic experience.
Gibson had an exceptional talent and was awarded the Tagore Medal as the college's outstanding student. He was now ready to take his place in the professional musical world.
Now, when we left college, I went as principal tenor to Carl Rosa Opera Company, a mistake which Alec always maintained I had made. He said, you went to the wrong company. And he went to Sadler's Wells.
Gibson spent 2 years as a repetiteur at Sadler's Wells before being offered a post at the BBC in Glasgow as assistant conductor to one of the great orchestral trainers, Ian White.
I started off as his assistant, not being afraid of him, but shall we say somewhat in awe of his tremendous ability. He had one of the finest ears in the profession. Now, this is generally acknowledged by everybody who knew him.
With 2 years of rigorous training and professional conducting experience behind him, Gibson was showing both talent and promise. After his BBC interlude, he returned to Sadler's Wells, initially as a staff conductor and eventually as musical director, the youngest in the history of the company. He was only 31. 2 years later, with the London musical establishment seemingly at his feet, he made a decision that would change both his life and Scotland's musical history.
When Alexander Gibson decided he wanted to leave Sadler's Wells Opera to become musical director of the Scottish National Orchestra, we all thought that he was committing professional suicide.
I'm not conscious of modelling myself on any of the conductors I admire, although I suppose everybody is influenced to some extent by the work of others. I must say I count myself particularly fortunate in having studied with several teachers. Richard Austin at the Royal College of Music in London, Igor Markovich in Salzburg, Paul van Kempen in Siena. They all had different styles and something different to teach me. But I think in the end one learns more from the mistakes of one's fellow students on these courses.
It was quite risky coming to Scotland as a Scot, knowing how the Scots behave to one another.
The leader of the time, who was also an assistant conductor, considered it an insult that a young man had been promoted over him, and he left.
Any young conductor that comes in, especially with a fairly young orchestra, is going to be looked at suspiciously.
But amongst the general members of the orchestra, I think there was a feeling, good, let's give it a go and give him support, which they did.
Gibson's most famous predecessor at the SNO was Sir John Barbarolli. He was one of Gibson's mentors and was always keen to offer his advice.
He did play a tremendous part in encouraging me in the early days. And he said, you can go and conduct many orchestras, but as Toscanini said to me, yes, the great thing is to play the same orchestra every day of your life for a long period, and to tell them that the crotchet that they were playing in Brahms yesterday has to be long. And the same crotchet, the same little black dot with a stem on it, on the music in front of them, has to be short, because you're doing Mozart, my boy. And they say, what does he know?
Of his three immediate predecessors, Walter Susskind had a wide repertoire, including Bartók, Berg and Nielsen. Not so his successors. Neither Karl Rankel nor the Austrian Hans Swarovski seemed interested in music beyond the Viennese classics.
This was a notorious period, was Rankel refused to conduct Sibelius, and so did Swarovski, but they felt he was a second-rate composer. I remember Rankel once describing him as being the scrapings of the Viennese masters. And not only would he not conduct Sibelius himself, he wouldn't let other conductors come in and conduct Sibelius either.
Gibson's immediate action on taking over was to programme all 7 Sibelius symphonies in the first season. These were works he knew, loved and understood.
The organic way in which Sibelius's music grows and works and has its effect was something Alex was very good at. He was very good at shaping up diffuse forms.
He's a very dark composer in so many ways. But of course he's the musician's composer. I mean, you won't find, I don't think, an orchestral musician who doesn't like Sibelius.
The sound of an orchestra is created by the conductor who is conducting it at that particular moment. Now, if you have a permanent conductor who's conducting the orchestra half of its whole working time, that orchestra, as in the case of the SNO, will develop its own particular sound. And it will be that kind of sound because of the way the conductor conducts. If he conducts like that, the orchestra will make noises. If he conducts elegantly and gently, but clearly, there will be a more rounded sound. And that was the case with Alex. Andrew Porter, who was a very important critic at those times, was one of the first to see and to comment on the fact that the SNO had its own particular sound, which was the Gibson sound. It was warm, it was clear, it was rounded.
Gibson's personal revolution was beginning to take shape. In 1967, he took the SNO on its first foreign tour since 1896, playing its opening concert at the Holy of Holies, the Golden Room of the Musikverein in Vienna, followed by the famous Festspielhaus in Salzburg. The orchestra's first recording contracts further enhanced their reputation, and festivals around the country offered the SNO much more prestigious invitations.
His flexibility in his conducting style really made him a wonderful accompanist, and that was borne out by the international stars that used to come to Scotland just to work with Sir Alex.
Especially pianists Rubinstein, Gina Bachar, Clifford Curzon, and the younger virtuosos Vladimir Ashkenazy, Food Song from China, the amazing John Ogden, and many others whose talents Gibson spotted and encouraged.
Very influential in my career, especially in the early years. He was a marvellous accompanist and a marvellous initiator of just the right musical atmosphere and the mood at the right time. In other words, it was effortless. I just sat down and played to myself, and he was always there, sticking to me like glue, like a leech. He was just an instinctive, astonishingly talented man who happened to be exceptionally pleasant as a person, because they don't necessarily go together. But I've generally found that the big heads in conductors, or perhaps in any discipline, are generally rather mediocre people. People who are really exalted, really distinguished, don't need that. They realise that in this life you never get perfection whatever you do, and it's the buzz of approaching it that gives you the thrill.
The Edinburgh Festival Chorus was founded by Gibson and Lord Harwood to give an opportunity to the best amateur singers in Scotland to work with the best conductors in the world. But who would train it? Giulini suggested the music director of the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Edinburgh, the enigmatic Arthur Oldham. It was an inspired choice.
Whisper, whisper. Nothing. And dim. That's better. That gives her a chance.
The new choir, on its day the best in the world, opened the festival of 1965 with Mahler's gigantic 8th Symphony.
Well, the first night in August 1965 was an absolutely tremendous occasion. A certain amount of apprehension. This was the first night that this new chorus was singing. But the atmosphere was electric. There were about 250 in the chorus, another 150 children singing, and an orchestra of about 150 to 200. Sir Alexander Gibson himself, of course. So it really was a tremendous occasion. And we sang our hearts out, we enjoyed it, and the applause at the end was absolutely fantastic.
He had this great response to the occasion. Possibly his greatest quality as a conductor was a wonderful ability to see over a long range.
The pacing was so essential so that the mind, the musical mind, both the players and the audience didn't get bored with it, knew the direction it was going and yet never rushed it. I think that was his main strength, this ability to see further than the phrase in front of him.
One of the last things I did before I left Scottish Opera was I worked on Meistersinger with him and the revival. And in that sort of 5 hours, you know, he knew where he was going at 3.5 hours and at 4.5 hours. And he had a superb long-range command of pace. He approached the climax in his own way, and somehow it was just the right time.
One of the most controversial aspects of Gibson's musical persona was his beat. It was certainly unorthodox, quite often more horizontal than vertical. His philosophy was that he regarded his players and singers as intelligent colleagues and preferred to control and encourage them with the baton while moulding and shaping the phrase with his left hand. If not universally admired, it was a highly individual approach to making music.
His conducting style was elegant and rounded, wasn't always completely clear, and orchestras who were not familiar with him sometimes found it difficult to follow his beat.
I played with people with no beats at all, but you look at their eyes, Kemper, for instance, you just knew what he wanted. It's a telepathic thing. It's very difficult to understand. Or a beat is quite an arbitrary way of putting over what you want. But you do need it at times when there are rhythmic, Rite of Spring or something like that. It's horrendous. If you haven't got a beat, you need it.
I can beat the beginning of the Ninth Symphony. Ba-bong,
Yeah.
ba-bong, ta-ta-ta-tim, bom, bom, bom. I can do that. But I don't want that. I don't want pa-bong. I want pa-bong, pa-bong. So he said, pa-bong.
It was hard to follow. He detested being a bandmaster. He could do it when required, and he just made thousands of jokes about the non-existent downbeat, jokes against himself. Sometimes it was like stirring the porridge, and sometimes it was like moulding, smoothing the bed, you know. But that was what he liked, and that goes with that love for the big romantic climax and the pacing and so on. Players sometimes got distressed. I sometimes got distressed because a chorus likes the kind of chorus masters downbeat and that simple, unsubtle thing that chorus masters do. And all the choruses I worked, of course, got absolutely used to him and loved him.
I remember once he was doing La Traviata in Louisville, and the orchestra were getting ready to start the prelude, and he lifted the baton and did, that's too loud, before they played a note. But he could tell by the way the violinist was perched that it was wrong for the opening of Traviata. So he sort of fumbled around and probably lit another cigarette or found the baton and sort of did something like this, you know, and the players come in exactly the way he wanted it. the uncertainty that he bred in the players was affected by the way revealed in the sound. And I mean, that's genius.
When he had to give the kind of no holds barred, no doubt beat for a big entry, he was fine. I mean, after all, Furtwängler and people like that were notorious for non-beats, and Alec had the same romantic way of shaping things. But I mean, I can remember entries, the opening of Mallarade, the opening of Zadok the Priest, where the chorus comes in after that long, famous build-up, and he came in with a kind of pushed beat, which gave the chorus exactly what they wanted.
Alex had the same gift that Beecham had, which was the ability to set a pulse going and then to allow his woodwind principals, his principal flute or his principal horn, to play their solos their own way without disrupting the fundamental pulse. And that's one of the great secrets about good conducting. And Alex had it.
One of his strong points was that if you did have a solo, and in those days there were quite a few, even viola solos floating around, and he did allow one to play them. He never interfered musically with your ideas, and so that was a plus, I think, from that point of view.
Gibson had charm and charisma. He had that ability to attract and hold an audience. He was a musician who never lost touch with his roots, and was one of a handful of people whose name was known to most Scots.
Alex brought a terrific awareness to all parts of the population of Scotland. He knocked on the head the elitist idea. He was very much, I suppose, the modern jargon, he's a people person. He wasn't bound up with facts, figures and grey suits, although he could do that, obviously, very well.
He was a sort of cultural hero in Glasgow, and boards were, as it were, flattered to be associated with this man. He had wit, he had tact, he was very sensitive, and he had a kind of innate modesty, which was very attractive. And I'm sure he won over quite a lot of hard-headed businessmen to the cause of the opera or the orchestra.
For the first half of Gibson's tenure as musical director, the SNO visited all the major venues round Scotland. Relatively speaking, money was not a major issue, as they were generously supported by both the local authorities and the Arts Council.
I think the other deciding factor that makes things very different these days is that there is so much competition, so much more competition. When Sir Alex was music director, if you wanted to hear an orchestral concert, it was the SNO as it was then, or nothing.
BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra wasn't then a real competitor. And since we had season tickets in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen and Dundee, you could build up your loyal public in each of the four cities. And because they were loyal to you, when I say to you, I mean to the orchestra and particularly to Alex, you could afford to take risks.
Gibson was astutely aware that music could easily become a museum culture. In the 10 years before he had taken over, the SNO had given only 4 premieres. During his tenure, Gibson conducted 54, including the British premieres of Schoenberg's Violin Concerto and Stockhausen's Gruppen. One bold innovation was to run, in conjunction with Glasgow University, a triennial festival devoted to modern music.
The orchestra itself, I think, was shocked at the number of premieres, modern works that they were being asked to do, and the connections with people like Hans Werner Henze. And I can remember now, to this day, being in a room with some Ligeti, for instance, and Berio, all in the same room, not talking to each other, until they were given some food, and then they sort of came out their corners and talked to each other. But to be in that relationship with these people as a sort of normal, everyday thing was so exhilarating.
Like most orchestral players, I'm a little bit cynical about new things, or was then, and it was a real shot in the arm to see Gruppen being performed on the floor of the St Andrews Hall with 3 conductors with 3 stopwatches. It was something new, and I think it opened up a new sort of vista for the orchestral player.
You know the composer's complaint, they get 1 performance and that's it. But with Gibson, you got 4. And he sometimes repeated that. And this was a joy to us all.
Well, in a way, I was a relative Johnny-come-lately to Musica Nova. It had begun when I was very young. But in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, I remember the likes of, we told Lutoslavsky coming, Brian Fernyhough was featured. And in a sense, that really put Glasgow and Scotland on the map as far as the international music culture of our own time is concerned.
But one good thing about Alex was that he would rehearse it so well that when you did perform it, either you liked it or didn't like it, but at least you gave it every chance.
Festivals such as Musica Nova and Gibson's pioneering work with the SNO were reshaping the musical map of Scotland. But Gibson had even bigger aspirations. At secret meetings, he was planning the most important cultural development in Scotland since the foundation of the Edinburgh Festival. Three years after Gibson's arrival, Scottish opera was a reality. He had judged the political climate to perfection.
There was a whole atmosphere at that time, you know, beginning with Harold Wilson and Jenny Lee was the Minister for the Arts. And the attitude then was that if opera is good enough for the aristocracy, it's good enough for the man in the street in Scotland.
Gibson's mission was to lay the treasures of opera at the feet of the people of Scotland. He recruited Richard Telfer, an Edinburgh schoolteacher, Ainsley Miller, a chartered surveyor and opera buff, and Ian Rodger, a wily Glasgow solicitor. With a guarantee of £2,000 shared between the Arts Council and Scottish Television, Scottish Opera ran its first season, presenting 2 operas in the space of a week. It was a huge critical success worldwide and a musical milestone for Scotland. Its impressive launch was noted in prestigious opera houses around Europe.
One day in the papers I read a review of this new company in Scotland that had put on a one-week season of Madame Butterfly and Pelléas and Mélisande. And the review was very good. So I thought, oh well, this may be a foothold, you know, back in Britain. I'll write to Alex Gibson, who was cited as the artistic director. I wrote to him and said, any chance of doing something for you in your next season, whenever that may be.
And then the next year came Otello and Della Piccola's Volo di Notte. And it was clear then that he was an opera company which wasn't just wanting to do standard things. You know, it wasn't doing Traviata, it was doing Otello.
I was 16 and we were full of excitement and enthusiasm to go and sing for this company, naturally. Singers came from the Glasgow Grand, the Edinburgh Grand, and a bus brought a contingent from Aberdeen. And it was just the enormity of the sound, the enthusiasm of the people, and the spirit within the company, which was palpable. You can't buy that. The first rehearsal was in Glasgow University, and it was taken by Leon Lovett, a gentle Englishman who came up to take the chorus. He started the rehearsal, and the first chord of Dio fulgor de la bufera raised the roof. And I had a tingling sensation that went through my toes right up to the top of my head, as if I had died and gone to heaven. And I said, I want that. And I got it. I got it later on. I got it.
Gibson had a talent for gathering gifted people around him. To run the company, he recruited Peter Hemmings, a former colleague at Sadler's Wells. They were a perfect partnership with unified ideas on the aims and composition of the company.
It was based as an ensemble company, as companies were in those days, so that we as ensemble artists would do some major roles, a lot of minor roles, and of course covering of the major roles, understudying the major roles. So from the time that I started, I went full time in 1966. And I never worked for less than 35 weeks of the year. So, I mean, it was a stable employment, which the youngsters don't get nowadays. I used to stand in the wings all the time and watch these wonderful singers and find out what they were doing and why and how they used the stage and paced performances and whatever. It was great.
Anthony Besh produced the company's first real smash hit, Cosi fan tutti. The cast included a surprising but inspired choice.
I was associated with very serious things, and I think they wondered whether I had enough sense of humour to play Dorabella. But when they decided to ask me, I was absolutely thrilled to bits, because it was a different thing for me. It was a light-hearted and gave me a chance to play comedy. Well, the rest is history. You know, the production was such a success. And I used to, for years afterwards, be talking with people in Germany or America or whatever, and I would go to an opera house and they would have photographs of our production in the dressing rooms. It was so valued and so well thought of. It a sort of benchmark, really.
Gibson's next major project was groundbreaking. The first complete performance in Britain of one of the largest operatic epics, The Trojans.
This was an exercise in getting frightened, being at Scottish Opera. Berlioz, the Trojans being one of the largest opera works in the whole repertory. When the idea came up, we ought to have a go at that. I, of course, was all for it. I had nothing to lose, so to speak.
The whole venture was such an exciting musical happening in this country then. So the whole climate around these things, let's do Trojans, well, it was an enormous thing to do. Very, very brave, very, very costly, but somehow or other, the tenor of the times made it possible.
The amazing thing was that Alex wanted to do the whole work in English without a single bar cut. And that's what we achieved. And most people said, you can't do it, it won't work. But it did.
Just do once more. If you can wait after you've done Seas a Refuge. So we get the chord in.
Thorough piano rehearsals. He always made time for those wherever. And it is a very important thing. And I suppose he used those rehearsals as a sort of discovery of what the individual singer was capable of, where the weaknesses lie, and where the difficult bits of either a score or an operatic role were. I remember the excitement of, after weeks of doing it with piano, suddenly all the forces were present, all these great sounds were suddenly surrounding us, and it was like being whacked over the head with a hammer.
In those days, it was actually convenient for the SNO to play a certain number of operas a year, because their winter season would finish in April, and then they had their proms in June, and they needed something to fill in between. And obviously, if you had access to a fine international orchestra with 10 double, 8 double basses, I mean a really full string strength, it was sensible to do pieces that would use the full orchestra.
Incredibly, Wagner's Ring Cycle, the pinnacle of all operas, was performed less than 10 years after the company's founding.
I thought, oh, everybody would like a chance to do the Ring. Whether this is quite the right moment for Scottish opera to start it, I don't know. But let's have a go. Once it was decided to go ahead, because I was very, very much on top of the world.
Gibson wanted to be a Wagner conductor, but had never, I don't think, really had the opportunity. But he now had that opportunity, and he rose to it. I think for me, it was one of the most exciting events I've ever attended, you know, as a critic. These 4 nights in the Glasgow King's Theatre at that time, very nice theatre for opera, and the SNO was in the pit. The pit had spread itself out into the auditorium and into boxes at the sides of the stage. And one saw this vast orchestra sitting there, because it wasn't a deep pit, it was almost at Stall's level. And I remember I was sitting beside the critic of the Sunday Times, Desmond Shaw Taylor, and he leaned over the edge of the balcony and turned to me and he said, "What's your Covent Garden new?"
The success of The Ring, and indeed the first 10 years of Scottish opera, was due in large measure to the presence of the SNO in the pit. Gibson had built up the numbers in the orchestra to 96, making it one of the largest symphony orchestras in Britain. But with the continuing expansion of Scottish opera, there was an inevitable clash of priorities.
The members of the orchestra saw themselves as a symphony orchestra, not as a pit band, as they would put it. And they felt that what they had become members of that orchestra for was not really being fulfilled for them.
It was a difficult question, and the boards of the two organisations were not at odds with each other, but I know that the board of the Scottish National Orchestra began to feel that the orchestra was spending too much time in the pit.
For a symphony orchestra to go into an orchestral pit, apart from the cramped conditions, relatively speaking, I thought that was a wonderful experience.
A lot of the musicians and others thought that Alex had, was paying too much attention to the opera and not enough attention to the orchestra, and I've no doubt the opera thought that they were not getting their attention, etc., etc., etc.
I think if we'd been asked to do more than 6 weeks a year, I think we would have resented it.
Gibson's aspiration was to have a vast musical pool of players, out of which various orchestras could be drawn according to demand.
Gibson's real long-term ambition was that he would transform the SNO into a sort of Scottish version of the Vienna Philharmonic, which of course is an opera orchestra and a symphony orchestra.
Since Gibson was the head of both major cultural organisations, the Arts Council regarded the Vienna model as too much of a monopoly. A separate chamber orchestra was favoured, so emerged the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and sometime later also a separate opera orchestra. With his orchestral master plan in ruins, Gibson's next project was built on surer foundations. In 1975, he and Peter Hemmings bought the Theatre Royal from Scottish Television and turned it into Scotland's first opera house. The problems it would bring were neither known nor imagined. New building, new challenges. In the euphoria, 4 new operas were commissioned from Scottish composers, one of them hailed as a masterpiece, The Catiline Conspiracy by Ian Hamilton.
But it's much more effective without it.
Young producers, like the talented David Pountney, were given their chance.
He had a wide range of operatic interest, including, of course, Golden Cockerel, which was a terrific hit. Normally, the Cockerel's voice is just off stage, but he introduced a trapeze artist.
When Hemmings left Scottish Opera in 1977, it seemed the halcyon days had gone. But there were still many highlights to come.
Generally to you, isn't she? Then you sing Vera, Vera.
Yes.
I don't know, but she's
we'll
hardly...
do, and I ask
let's
you
do it,
again.
let's
Yes,
see.
let's do it.
He always had, I think, a very special gift for accompanying voice. You were quite conscious of the fact that he had a remarkable talent for nursing the singer, understanding the problems. He was always there. He didn't force you into something with which you were uncomfortable. He knew how to get the best out of his singers.
I think all the singers felt after the first few minutes, very safe in his hands. They realized he was going to help them, he was going to guide them, he was going to do everything he possibly could for them.
He certainly wasn't one of those conductors who imposed an interpretation on a singer. He was very happy if you had an interpretation, you knew how you wanted to perform the piece, to give you the space to do that, to express yourself. And that reminds me of a performance we did in Edinburgh at the Edinburgh Proms of Exultate Jubilate by Mozart. And we'd done the rehearsal in the afternoon and got to the performance in the evening, did the first movement, perfect, second movement, everything absolutely as we'd planned. And then we got to the Alleluia, and he just went off like a rocket. It was amazing, the speed that he took this piece. Made it very exciting, which I'm sure is what he had up his sleeve. And I don't think he would have done that on purpose to upset me in any way. I think he knew I probably could cope with it. And it made for a very exciting end to the Exultate Jubilate.
Throughout his career, Scotland's musical life seemed to revolve around Gibson. Yet around him there was also change and, later, criticism, though his personal commitment to Scotland was never in doubt.
There was an enormous strain on one person to do both jobs, because what people in this country don't realise is that conductors are asked to do about at least 3 times the amount of work that foreign conductors are asked to do in their country. So he, I know, was working very hard with the orchestra, with many programs to prepare, and the rehearsals that take, because I know that when I had a symphony orchestra, the idea of taking so many weeks off to prepare an opera just wasn't feasible. It was very rare that I was able to do it. So how he managed, I really don't know.
I don't think that man ever went to bed or to sleep, to my knowledge, anyway, until about 2 o'clock in the morning, because his mind was still alive with music all the time.
Many honours came Gibson's way from towns, city councils, and academic institutions. Official recognition was bestowed with a CBE, followed by a knighthood in 1977. But perhaps the greatest honour was accorded by the Finnish government when it awarded Gibson the prestigious Sibelius Medal in recognition of his lifelong championing of the composer. Gibson would be proud to see his name associated with Scotland's only opera school. He would be pleased to see it treat opera as a modern art form with Scottish composers to the fore.
Performance of The Vanishing Bridegroom, please take your seats. Thank you.
He had his faults as well, of course. perhaps one of which, he was certainly always accused of this, was that he stayed too long, that he sacrificed, if you like, an international career for one which took place largely in his homeland. And he would not have seen that as a fault because he believed in Scotland.
My own feeling is that possibly he stayed 5 years too long in both the orchestra and in the Scottish Opera. But then I don't know the full facts of his circumstances and what he wanted to do, and perhaps he felt he hadn't achieved everything.
I don't think he stayed too long. I mean, you wouldn't say that Bob Raleigh stayed too long in Manchester. He'd got so that he was a figurehead not only of the orchestra and the opera, but arts in general and Scottish culture. And I think if he'd had more support from those that counted with the influence, I think he would have stayed on, and could only have been good. We wouldn't be in the mess that we are in Scotland now with the arts if Alex had still been around. He would have nipped that very smartly in the bud.
Gibson took the decision to retire from both the opera and the orchestra after 25 years in charge, the longest residency by a British-born conductor. As he took his final bows, what of the prophetic statement he had written in the school magazine 40 years earlier, that he looked forward to the day when Scotland would have great performers and a distinct musical life of its own? If that was a personal aspiration, he certainly lived up to it.
Unquestionably, his legacy will be to have put serious music, opera and symphonic works, onto the regular map of Scottish cultural activity.
In time to come, he will be even more highly rated than now. People will realise what he actually did contribute in time, but it may not be just yet.
Perhaps it's time for our own political classes and business leaders to look back at the 60s and 70s to see just what an enlightened time that was, and where artists and those in the public sphere interacted in a very fruitful way. We can learn a lot from looking at that very crucial time.
He built up this marvelous, marvelous endeavour. Endeavours always have their ups and downs, but in the end there is a lasting heritage, really, which you cannot wipe away.